beloved television star, two innocent little boys, and a shallow grave hidden beneath freshly laid concrete in a quiet family garden. This is not a fictional thriller. This is not a dramatic screenplay. This is the real and devastating story of what happened behind the closed doors of a modest bungalow on Pembroke Road in Erith, southeast London. A mother who found the courage to finally walk away from a dangerous man. Two children who never even had the chance to wake up. And a cold-blooded killer who flew thousands of miles across the world, drank cold beers on a sunlit beach, and laughed out loud while his family lay buried and frozen in the ground he left behind. That is the story we are telling today on True Crime Web. Stay with us. On the 5th of January 2016, the winter air in Erith was absolutely freezing. Erith is a quiet and unremarkable town tucked into the southeastern corner of London. It is the kind of place where working families build modest, peaceful lives. The streets are lined with neat homes, parked cars, and ordinary front gardens. Nothing dramatic ever happens in Erith. Nothing ever draws a crowd. Nothing ever pulls a police cordon across a residential street. But on that dark and bitter winter morning, Pembroke Road was completely blocked off. Blue and white police tape stretched tightly across the entrance of a small family bungalow. Number 51 was no longer just a family home. It was now the center of a massive homicide investigation. Sian Blake was 43 years old. She was a familiar and deeply beloved face to millions of British television viewers. Years earlier, she had starred in one of the most watched soap operas in British television history, the legendary EastEnders. She was a highly gifted actress with an enormous warmth about her, a woman who lit up every single scene she appeared in with a bright and natural smile. But the most important role Sian Blake ever played was never on a television screen. Her most important role was being a fiercely dedicated and deeply loving mother. She had two beautiful little boys. Zachary was 8 years old. Amon was just 4 years old. Those two children were the absolute and undisputed center of her entire existence on this earth. But the family had not been seen by a single person since the 13th of December. 3 long and terrifying weeks had slowly dragged past. Christmas came and went without a single word from Sian. The house at number 51 sat in total darkness. No lights switched on in the evenings, no curtains moved, no children played in the front garden. The suffocating silence pouring out of that property was completely terrifying to everyone who knew her. Sian's family members were in a state of absolute panic. The neighbors sensed something was deeply and horribly wrong. The police knew that every single hour that passed made the situation more desperate. Homicide detectives finally secured the legal search warrant they needed. They arrived at the property in large numbers on that freezing January morning. They wore thick winter coats against the biting cold. They pulled heavy blue latex gloves carefully onto their hands. They walked up the paved driveway in complete silence, one behind the other, bracing themselves for whatever was waiting on the other side of that front door. The lead detective reached out and turned the handle. He pushed the door open slowly. The officers stepped forward into the dark hallway, and they stopped. Every single one of them stopped walking at the exact same moment. A powerful and overwhelming smell hit them directly in the face the second they crossed the threshold. This house smelled heavily and unmistakably of strong industrial bleach. It was not the light, natural smell of a family home that had been recently cleaned. This was something far more extreme and far more deliberate. Someone had scrubbed every surface of this property from top to bottom with heavy chemical cleaners. It was completely unnatural. It was deeply alarming. And every experienced detective standing in that hallway knew exactly what it meant. Killers clean. Killers scrub. Killers pour bleach over the evidence of what they have done and pray the chemical smell masks the truth beneath. This was a massive red flag. This was the first sign that something deeply evil had taken place inside these walls. The detectives moved slowly and carefully from room to room. They checked the living area. The furniture appeared perfectly arranged and in its correct position. They walked into the kitchen. They moved down the hallway toward the boys' bedrooms. The small beds were neatly made, but the rooms felt completely hollow and stripped bare. Personal items had been removed. Clothes were missing from the closets. Toys and shoes that should have been scattered across the floor were simply gone. The house felt less like a family home and more like a stage theatrical set. It felt like someone had systematically packed up an entire life and simply discarded it like rubbish. The detectives found no bodies anywhere inside the house, but not a single officer believed for even one moment that this family had simply packed a bag and walked away. The overwhelming and suffocating chemical smell of bleach told a very dark and very specific story. The lead investigator gathered his team together in the narrow hallway. They needed to go outside. They needed to search the garden. The officers stepped out through the back door into the enclosed outdoor space behind the bungalow. The winter frost had settled across the grass overnight. The air outside was absolutely still and deadly quiet. The detectives formed a line across the garden. They scanned the ground methodically and carefully. They looked for any visible signs of a struggle in the dirt. They looked for discarded clothing or personal items that might have been dropped or thrown. Then, one officer raised his hand and pointed toward the back of the garden. He had noticed something completely out of place near the base of the back fence. A section of the garden path looked brand new. Heavy concrete paving slabs had been laid flat against the ground in what appeared to be a recent and hastily completed job. But the edges around those stones were messy and rough. The grey cement dust was far too fresh and far too bright compared to everything surrounding it. The new stones did not match the weathered and aged look of the existing patio area at all. Someone had laid those heavy blocks very recently. Someone had done it in a hurry. And every officer standing in that freezing garden felt a cold and devastating chill move through their entire body. They understood the grim and terrible reality of what their job was requiring them to face. Killers use fresh concrete for one specific and sickening reason. They use it to hide the evidence of what they have done. They use it to seal away a massacre forever. The forensic team called immediately for the necessary equipment. Thick steel crowbars and large heavy shovels were brought into the garden. 2 officers jammed a heavy metal bar underneath the first concrete slab. They leaned down with all their combined weight and pushed. The massive stone shifted and slowly lifted off the ground. They grabbed the rough edges and shoved it aside. They worked their way across the garden, repeating this process over and over again. They moved the heavy slabs one by one until their muscles burned from the exertion in the freezing winter air. And what they found beneath those stones confirmed every one of their worst fears. The earth underneath had been completely destroyed and disturbed. The dark brown mud was loose, soft, and visibly turned over. It was not the compacted, settled soil of an undisturbed garden. It was the loose, freshly dug earth of a grave. The officers picked up their shovels. They began to dig into the cold mud with extreme caution, scraping away the top layer of frozen dirt inch by careful inch. They moved deliberately and precisely, desperate not to damage any potential evidence that might be lying beneath the surface. 2 feet deep into the cold ground, a metal shovel connected with something soft. It was not a rock. It was not a thick tree root. The sound it made was dull and deeply disturbing. The lead detective dropped immediately to his knees in the mud. He used his gloved hands to pull the wet, heavy dirt away from the shape below. He brushed the soil aside with careful, deliberate movements, and he revealed a thick layer of clear plastic sheeting tied tightly around a very large and unmistakable shape. The officers kept digging. They found a second wrapped bundle beside the first. Then they found a third, a smaller one. There were 3 shapes in the mud. 3 plastic-wrapped bundles in a shallow grave beneath the concrete paving of a family garden. The homicide detective stood up from his knees. Every officer on that scene understood exactly what they were looking at. The 3-week search was over. They had found Sian Blake. They had found 8-year-old Zachary. They had found 4-year-old Amon. The brutal murders were now a confirmed and heartbreaking reality. The quiet family home in Erith had been a slaughterhouse. Someone had systematically wiped out a mother and her 2 completely innocent children. Then they had buried that family in their own back garden beneath heavy concrete slabs, as though their lives meant nothing at all. The killer had believed those stones would keep his terrible secrets hidden forever. He was completely and utterly wrong. Before we go deeper into the devastating timeline of how this happened and how the man responsible thought he could simply walk away, please take a moment to let us know in the comments what time you are watching this video. And if you have not already done so, please subscribe to True Crime Web. Every subscription helps us honor Sian, Zachary, and Amon. We will never allow their names to be forgotten. Sian Blake was a true and remarkable television talent. At 43 years old, she had brought genuine warmth and enormous skill to one of the biggest shows in British broadcasting history. Her character on EastEnders was beloved by millions of loyal viewers across the country. She had a career that many actors spend an entire lifetime working toward. She was also a trained and dedicated sign language interpreter, a woman who spent her days helping others communicate with the world around them. She cared deeply about people. She gave generously of herself. But the fame and the television cameras and the public recognition never changed who she was at her core. Her true and unshakable passion was always her own family. Her 2 little boys were her entire universe and the driving force behind every single decision she made. Zachary was 8 years old and full of energy and intelligence. Amon was just 4 years old, sweet and playful, and completely adored by everyone who knew him. Sian had stepped back from the public spotlight deliberately and willingly in order to focus on raising her children in the best possible way. She wanted a quiet, ordinary, and completely safe life in Erith. She wanted her boys to grow up happy and protected and loved. And for a time, life appeared peaceful from the outside. But a terrible and life-changing nightmare had begun in the final months of 2015. Sian had started experiencing sudden and frightening physical changes in her body. She felt profoundly weak in ways she had never felt before. Her legs felt impossibly heavy when she tried to walk. She struggled to move around her own home with any ease. Her hands had started to feel numb and unresponsive. She went to her doctors for extensive medical testing, hoping for reassurance and a simple explanation. The test results came back in the autumn of that year. A doctor sat Sian down in a clinical hospital room and delivered news that no human being should ever have to hear. She had been diagnosed with motor neuron disease. It is one of the most brutal and merciless conditions a person can face. It attacks the brain and the nervous system. It slowly and systematically shuts the entire human body down, muscle by muscle, function by function. The person gradually loses the ability to walk. They lose the ability to speak. They eventually lose the ability to breathe. The doctors were direct and honest with Sian. The disease was terminal and completely without cure. Her health was already declining at a frightening pace. She was facing the end of her life at just 43 years old, with 2 young boys depending entirely on her love and presence. In the face of this devastating diagnosis, Sian desperately needed comfort, support, and genuine human compassion. But she was sharing her home and her life with a man who was deeply incapable of providing any of those things. His name was Arthur Simpson-Kent. He was 48 years old, and he was Sian's long-term partner. He was the biological father of Zachary and Amon, but he was not a loving or devoted family man in any meaningful sense of the word. Arthur Simpson-Kent was a controlling, manipulative, and deeply dangerous narcissist who had spent years constructing a life built entirely on his own comfort and convenience. He did not hold a legitimate job. He worked as a local cannabis dealer, bringing illegal activity and criminal risk directly into the family home, shared by his partner and their young children. He treated Sian with consistent disrespect and contempt. He constantly manipulated her emotions and her sense of reality. He deliberately undermined her confidence and her sense of self-worth in order to maintain dominance over her. The relationship was broken in every meaningful way. Sian's family had seen the warning signs clearly and early. They deeply disliked Arthur and made no secret of it among themselves. They saw straight through his arrogant charm and his self-serving behavior. They knew he was exploiting Sian and taking advantage of her generous nature. They had begged her on multiple occasions to leave him and bring her boys somewhere safe. They worried constantly about the emotional and physical well-being of Zachary and Amon inside that household. But escaping a controlling and manipulative partner is never as simple as walking through a front door. Arthur had spent years building invisible walls around Sian's life, and he kept a very tight grip on everything within those walls. The terminal medical diagnosis changed everything for Sian in the most profound and clarifying way. Faced with the absolute certainty of her own approaching death, she found a new and unshakable mental clarity. She looked at her 2 beautiful boys. She thought about the time she had left. She made a decision that took every ounce of courage she possessed. On the 13th of December 2015, Sian travelled to visit her mother in Leighton, East London. She was physically very weak by this point. Her body was failing her in ways that were visible and painful, but her mind was completely focused and utterly clear. She sat down in her mother's living room surrounded by her family, and she told them the absolute truth. She was finished with Arthur Simpson-Kent. She was done living under his roof and under his control. She wanted to pack her belongings and leave Erith permanently. She asked her mother whether she and her 2 boys could come home to the family house and live there properly. She wanted safety. She wanted love. She wanted her children surrounded by people who genuinely cherished them during whatever time she had remaining. Her mother said yes without a single moment of hesitation. The entire family was flooded with relief. Plans were immediately put in motion to move Sian and the boys out of the Erith bungalow as quickly as possible. Sian felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. She could finally see a clear and real path out of the darkness she had been living in. She returned home to Erith that evening. She knew she had to face Arthur one final time. She had to look him in the eye and tell him that it was over. But Arthur Simpson-Kent was a deeply arrogant man with a profoundly fragile and dangerous ego. A narcissist cannot process rejection in the way that a normal and healthy person does. They do not feel sadness. They do not feel heartbreak. They feel rage. They feel a consuming and overwhelming fury at the audacity of someone daring to remove themselves from their control. Arthur realized in those moments that he was about to lose everything he had built his comfortable life upon. Sian was leaving. Her family would cut him off completely. He would be left with nothing and no one. He absolutely refused to accept that reality. And in refusing to accept it, he made the most monstrous decision a human being is capable of making. He decided that if he could not keep them, he would destroy them. The night of the 14th of December arrived. Sian Blake had returned to the Erith bungalow from her visit to her mother. She carried an enormous emotional weight on her shoulders, but also a new and determined sense of purpose. She told Arthur Simpson-Kent directly and clearly that their relationship was permanently finished. She told him she was moving back to her family home. She told him she was taking Zachary and Amon with her. Arthur listened to every word she said, and what moved across his face in those moments was not sadness, not grief, not even a shadow of genuine human emotion for the woman he had spent years with and the children he had fathered. What moved across his face was cold and calculating rage. He waited. He said very little. And when the house grew quiet, and Sian, exhausted by her illness and the emotional weight of the day, sat down to rest, Arthur Simpson-Kent moved. He retrieved a small and heavy axe. He moved silently through the house he shared with his family. He walked up directly behind Sian Blake, the mother of his children, a woman weakened by a terminal illness that had already stolen much of her physical strength and left her largely defenseless. He raised the weapon above his head, and he brought it down with full and devastating force against the back of her head. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Sian was rendered unconscious in an instant. She collapsed to the floor. She could not call out. She could not fight back. She had not even seen him coming. But even this was not enough to satisfy the rage driving him. He put the axe aside. He took out a knife, and he cut her throat. Sian Blake, beloved mother, gifted actress, brave woman who had spent her final weeks trying to protect her children, took her last breath on the living room floor of the home she had worked so hard to build for her family. She was 43 years old. Arthur Simpson-Kent stood in the silence of that room. He wiped the blood from his hands, and then he picked up the weapons again. He walked down the hallway. He pushed open the door to his children's bedroom. Zachary was 8 years old. Amon was 4 years old. They were asleep in their small beds, completely unaware, dreaming the innocent dreams of little children who felt entirely safe in their own home. They trusted their father. They had no reason in the world not to. Arthur walked to Zachary's bed first. He raised the axe. He brought it down on his sleeping 8-year-old son. He then ensured the child could not survive. He turned and walked across the small room to where 4-year-old Amon lay sleeping. He did the same thing again. In the space of a few terrible minutes, Arthur Simpson-Kent had committed a brutal and premeditated triple homicide. He had wiped out his entire family, and the house was silent again. What followed was cold, calculated and deeply revealing of the kind of man Arthur Simpson-Kent truly was. There was no breakdown. There were no tears. There was no moment of horror or remorse at what he had done. Instead, he immediately began a highly organized and systematic cover-up operation. He went to the garage and retrieved thick rolls of heavy plastic sheeting. He brought them inside. He wrapped Sian's body tightly in the clear plastic and sealed the edges with strong tape. He then did the same thing to Zachary and to little Amon. He wrapped his own children's bodies as though they were items to be disposed of. He dragged the plastic-wrapped bundles out through the back door into the garden, one by one, working methodically through the night. He dug a large and deep hole in the cold mud. He placed all 3 bodies inside. He covered them with the heavy, wet earth, and then, knowing that freshly disturbed soil would be immediately visible and suspicious, he retrieved heavy concrete paving slabs and laid them carefully and deliberately over the top of the grave, positioning each one to conceal what lay beneath as completely as possible. He then went back inside the house. He scrubbed the floors with strong industrial bleach. He painted over the blood-stained walls with fresh layers of paint. He worked for hours, erasing the evidence of what he had done to the people who had shared his life. And when dawn came on the 15th of December, Arthur Simpson-Kent made himself a coffee, moved through his freshly cleaned home, and began making plans to disappear. She would never address them with such cold and dismissive language. Furthermore, her advancing motor neuron disease had already significantly affected the use of her hands. Typing long, composed messages was extremely difficult and painful for her. Her family knew that Arthur was holding the phone, and those fake messages did not calm them down for a single moment. They terrified them completely. They called the police immediately. On the 16th of December, 2 uniformed officers arrived at the Erith bungalow to conduct a welfare check. Arthur answered the door. He was deliberately uncooperative and visibly annoyed at their presence. He blocked their view of the interior. He looked the officers directly in the eyes and told them without any visible hesitation that Sian had packed a bag and left with the boys to visit friends in Cambridge. He said she needed a break from the stress of everything. The officers entered the property and looked around. They saw the tidied rooms. They saw nothing that visibly indicated violence. The bodies were buried outside beneath the concrete. The bleach had done its job on the interior surfaces. The officers asked their questions and eventually left. But the police were highly suspicious of the story they had been given. A terminally ill woman does not simply vanish with 2 young children in the middle of winter without a word to her own family. A formal missing persons investigation was launched immediately. Detectives began looking more closely at Arthur Simpson-Kent, and Arthur, knowing the clock was now ticking against him, began to move. He gathered Sian's remaining clothing and personal belongings. He gathered the boys' toys and small shoes. He drove to a local charity shop and dropped off bags of his dead family's possessions. He came back and burned the rest in the back garden, along with personal documents and evidence. He packed his own bag. He took every piece of cash he could find. He walked out of the bungalow for the last time, locked the door behind him, and left Sian, Zachary, and Amon buried in the freezing mud without a single backward glance. He traveled north by train to Glasgow. From Glasgow he flew to Amsterdam. From Amsterdam he boarded a connecting flight to Ghana in West Africa, his country of origin. Thousands of miles from the cold mud in Erith, Arthur Simpson-Kent arrived in the small and beautiful coastal town of Busua, on Ghana's western shore. He rented a comfortable room. He walked along the sandy beach. He ate well. He drank cold beer in the warm sunshine. He approached young local women and invited them for drinks and meals. He laughed loudly in crowded bars. He danced on New Year's Eve with a glass in his hand, while his partner and his 2 children lay wrapped in plastic beneath frozen English soil. He felt completely and utterly invincible. He believed, with the total arrogance that had defined his entire adult life, that he had committed the perfect crime. But narcissists always make mistakes. And Arthur Simpson-Kent made a catastrophic one. Drunk on alcohol and swollen with his own arrogance, he sat down with a local man in Busua and began to talk. He talked too much. He said too much. He looked a stranger in the eye and confessed to killing his girlfriend and his 2 young children. He said it casually, as though he expected no consequences. He believed he was untouchable. He was deeply wrong. Word traveled fast through the small beach community. The horrified local man told others. Whispers spread, and at the same time, Scotland Yard had already contacted Ghanaian law enforcement. They had shared photographs and details. They had tracked the digital trail of his credit card and his flight records directly to the western coast of Ghana. The net was closing. On the 9th of January 2016, while Arthur Simpson-Kent stood near the beach in the warm ocean air with a drink in his hand, armed Ghanaian police officers surrounded him from every direction. They moved in fast and with absolute authority. They ordered him to the ground. His bravado evaporated completely. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, raised his hands, and was handcuffed and taken into custody. The holiday was over. British detectives travelled to Ghana in February and personally escorted him back to London. He arrived in steel handcuffs and was placed immediately into a cold concrete cell to await trial. In June of 2016, Arthur Simpson-Kent appeared at the Old Bailey, London's most famous criminal courthouse. He stood in the dock, pale and entirely without the swagger that had defined him in Busua. The wall of physical evidence assembled by the prosecution was devastating and comprehensive. The flight records, the concrete slabs, his own DNA on the murder weapons, the bleach, the freshly painted walls, the fake text messages, the charity shop donation of his dead family's belongings. Faced with all of it, Arthur Simpson-Kent entered formal guilty pleas to 3 counts of murder. But even in that moment, standing in the dock having already admitted to killing his entire family, he could not resist one final and deeply sickening attempt at manipulation. He told the court that the killings had been part of an agreed murder-suicide pact. He claimed Sian, suffering from her terminal illness, had begged him to end her life. He claimed she had also asked him to kill their children so they would not be left alone and motherless in the world. He claimed he had agreed to this plan, but had simply been unable to go through with ending his own life afterward. The prosecution dismantled this grotesque lie with precision and force. They pointed to every single action Arthur Simpson-Kent had taken in the days and weeks following the killings. A man devastated by a tragic and compassionate family pact does not scrub his home with industrial bleach. He does not repaint the walls to hide bloodstains. He does not send fraudulent text messages to a grieving grandmother. He does not burn his children's belongings in the back garden. He does not flee to the coast of West Africa, rent a comfortable room, party on New Year's Eve, and actively pursue romantic relationships with local women while his children lie in a shallow grave. Most powerfully of all, the prosecution reminded the court of what Sian Blake had actually been doing in the final days of her life. She had been sitting in her mother's living room making plans to escape Arthur Simpson-Kent. She had been asking her family to help her get her boys to safety. She had been reaching toward life and love and the protection of her children, not asking to be bludgeoned from behind in her own living room. The pact was a fantasy constructed by a man who could not bring himself to accept that his crimes had been driven by nothing more than rage, ego, and the refusal to let a brave woman walk out of his life with her children. On the 5th of October, 2016, the judge at the Old Bailey delivered his sentence. The courtroom was completely silent. The judge addressed Arthur Simpson-Kent directly and spoke plainly about the extreme cruelty of the crimes he had committed. He had attacked a terminally ill and physically defenseless woman from behind in her own home. He had then walked down a hallway and murdered 2 sleeping children, the youngest of whom was just 4 years old. He had shown no remorse at any point. He had fled the country and spent weeks living in comfort while his family lay buried in mud. The judge handed down a whole life order, one of the rarest and most severe sentences available under British law. Arthur Simpson-Kent will never appear before a parole board. He will never be considered for release. He will remain in a prison cell for the rest of his natural life. The doors will not open again. This case leaves us with a truth that is deeply painful but absolutely necessary to understand and to speak plainly. The most dangerous moment for a victim of domestic abuse is often the exact moment they decide to leave. When a controlling and violent person feels their grip beginning to loosen, when they sense that their victim has found the courage to walk away, the risk of extreme violence rises sharply and without warning. Sian Blake made the bravest decision of her life when she sat in her mother's living room and said she was done. She was right to make that decision. She deserved to spend her remaining time on this earth surrounded by love and safety and the warmth of her family. She deserved to watch her boys grow up in a home where they felt completely protected. That decision, that act of courage, should be celebrated and remembered. The fact that a dangerous and deeply disordered man took her life because of it is not a reflection on her bravery. It is a reflection of his evil. We must always take seriously the warning signs of controlling and manipulative behavior in relationships. We must support and believe those who are trying to find a way out of dangerous homes. We must never underestimate what a person driven by narcissism and rage is capable of when they feel they are losing control. We must do better for the women and children who need us most. But we will not close this story by dwelling on the man who committed these crimes. We close it by speaking the names of those who deserve to be remembered. Sian Blake was a gifted actress, a dedicated sign language interpreter, and above all else, a fiercely loving mother who gave everything she had for her children. She was 43 years old, and she deserved so much more time. Zachary was 8 years old. He was bright and energetic and full of the particular, irreplaceable energy that belongs only to children. Amon was 4 years old. He was sweet and playful and adored. Both boys deserved long and beautiful lives. They deserved to go to school, to grow up, to become the men their mother knew they could be. They were robbed of all of it. Sian, Zachary, and Amon, you are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. Not on this channel, not by the people who loved you, not by the millions who now know your names. If this story moved you, please like this video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you are watching from today. And if you have not yet subscribed to True Crime Web, please do it now. Every subscriber helps us continue telling the stories that must never be left untold. We will see you in the next one.